Thank you all for coming out at a, can we say, stressful time of year. Just maybe get your mind off of all those papers that you started in January, like you should have. Yes, of course, right? Okay, Nick? Fifth Amendment all around in here. It's very nice to be in Wisconsin. First time in Wisconsin. My only obligation or duty is to eat cheese curds, I think, which I've not had. And I'm looking very much forward to that, but between that and now, we have a lot to talk about. We're going to really get into some very interesting perspectives here. I think you'll find them interesting. But yeah, we can open it up to questions, stuff like that. But first, a little bit of background, I think, on what we're going to be talking about. So, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, president of Ukraine, probably had no idea what he was going to get into. Probably had no idea that things were going to go this way. It probably always kind of a shock to him, as it was a shock to all of us. But now he stands as this incredible symbolic figure of what democratic resistance looks like. His speeches are shown globally. Everybody is interested in having him come talk to their elected body. He's kind of on a concert tour. It's a little strange. Like, this is very unprecedented. The unprecedented level of this it's just really odd to me. And that kind of thing, as a scholar, gets my attention. A scholar of speech, I'm a rhetorician. We'll get into what that means a little bit later. Some of you might have an idea of what that is. You know, oh, a specialist in BS. Well, it's a little bit deeper than that. Yeah, so Zelensky's been on a tour. You know, he spoke to the Canadian Parliament. He spoke to the European Parliament. He spoke to the German Parliament. He spoke to the U.S. Congress. This is the speech I'll focus on at the end here. Also notable democratic organizations that he spoke to, not appearing here, the Grammys. Like, think about how weird that is. This is like such a strange thing. So what is it about his speeches that is so attractive? What is it about him as an orator that is so attractive to where, if this was any other country, any other time, this probably wouldn't be happening? So why is it that he'll come and speak to everybody? Why does he come and speak to everybody? Well, three things that come together that are specialties of mine that I'll go over very quickly to help you kind of understand how I'm going to approach it. I'm not going to do a very heavy talk with lots of citations or quotes from important scholars of the past. I'm going to kind of give you the 30,000-foot view. And then we can go into as much depth in the Q&A as you'd like. But there's lots of people I'll be referencing. If you want to go read their work, I'm happy to share it with you. But I'm not going to get into much of a heavy citation kind of talk, because I think it's much more important that we kind of appreciate and understand Zelenskyy as a rhetor and what it is he's doing and what challenge he's facing. But first, some framing terminology. So what is rhetoric? There are two things in rhetoric that I use when I'm looking at a speech that come from the American rhetorical theorist Kenneth Burke. And the first one is this combination of identification and division. Now, you might think of rhetoric as persuasion. This is the most common definition that people would come up with, besides outright lying or things that a politician might say for 500, please. This kind of thing. Identification and division is a much more robust and interesting way to think about what moves people to act. If they identify with someone, they want to be like them. They want to be close to them. They want to be similar to them. So they move in their comportment, their attitude, their views to be as close to that person as possible. Burke tells us simultaneously they're dividing from all other possible identifications, which we can read into and say, I see your motives. Once we think we've figured out someone's motives, we create an attitude towards that person. And this is the operation of rhetoric to Kenneth Burke. He was a 20th century American rhetorical theorist. It's a really interesting way to think about persuasion because it helps us explain a lot of weird persuasive moments in our culture and globally, which is, wow, look at the number of fallacies in that argument. Look at the bad evidence. Look at the distrust and dismissiveness of facts, or alternative facts. I don't know what my audience here does. Look at the alternative facts. Look at all this. How could they possibly believe that? And it's like, well, maybe rationality and reason has nothing to do with it. Maybe they see themselves in the other, and they move in that direction. Or maybe it's permissive discourse, right? So all these things make it much more complex in Burke's estimation. Motive and attitude I spoke about a little bit. Once I see how someone's identifying and dividing, I'll be like, I see what they're trying to do. I see what they're trying. We do this all the time. You see somebody wearing a particular shirt, And you're like, oh, they must love that band. It's like, well, it's my only clean shirt. It's actually not even mine, it's my brother's. I was late, this kind of thing. We might mistakenly think that they were putting on an identification, but it's not really in our control. It's in the control of the audience. And they might say, oh, I'm never talking to that person because they have this whatever shirt, Nickelback shirt, whatever. And I'm never going to talk to them. They're horrible. What terrible taste. And then we get an attitude. But what's interesting about Burke is he says, thinking about it this way, divorces us from thinking about, is their rhetoric factual or true? If you do that, then you're kind of frozen in a particular response to it. If they're lying or they're not using facts, then we dismiss them completely. But if we think about it as we're seeing them identify a particular way, we can always change our mind about our attitude. So it allows a lot of flexibility in negotiating the positions of other people. So this is how I approach rhetoric primarily. This is the most important, that slide went twice, it was so important. Look at that. So here's the Burke quote that I think is the most important for today's talk. He says, place identification closely with division, so close that they create some dissonance. The clear field begins to kind of shimmer. It starts to atomize, right? Somebody in here had a Nietzsche book, right? Nietzsche talks about the atomization of the, right? Nice to meet you, Nietzsche. That joke is always a nice to meet you and greet you, Nietzsche. It starts to atomize, things start to fall apart, and for Nietzsche it's tropes, right? Which is a rhetorical, he's kind of a rhetorician, right? It's kind of tropes hold the world together. These associations of things were like, this room could only be one thing. And we are taught our whole lives from tropes exactly what this room is. It's obviously a nightclub. No, it's a lecture room. It's a classroom. Right? The classroom looks like a classroom. A hospital room looks like a hospital. Right? A bar looks like a bar. It's not by accident. These are the things that make the world work. And so Burke is saying, once you put those close together to where you get a kind of a gestalt, the dots come out instead of the picture, then you get the invitation of rhetoric. And the normal operation of rhetoric is to freeze the dots and recast the scene in a way to get your audience to do what you want, right? So normally you say, look at the disaster, look at what's happening in front of us, but don't worry, here's the clear path forward. That's the typical way a rhetor would address a situation. It's not what Zelensky's doing. That's what makes it so interesting. He's actually doing something quite different. We'll see when we get to the clips. So one definition of rhetoric might be studying how to create meaning for others out of events, symbols, and phenomena. How do I make a community of meaning over symbols or events? What does it mean? What does it mean? We discuss and we come to some agreement, oftentimes temporarily, but then we return to it again. That's what rhetoric is. What does the symbol mean? So sometimes the American flag is a great thing, sometimes it's a horrible thing. Sometimes we burn it, sometimes we salute it, sometimes we do all kinds of different things with it, right? Take a jacket out of it or something. All this stuff. So public address. Public address is a subset of rhetoric, which is the study of speeches given by people who are usually in some official capacity, and they're giving those speeches towards an audience to try to get the audience to do something. So traditionally, this has been a really heavily critiqued part of rhetorical studies because it usually focuses on people who have access to power. And in this country, the traditional person who has access to power is a straight white man of high education. So you're leaving out a huge amount of people to study when you're thinking about addressing publics. That has been altered in recent years, and the critique is still ongoing. There's a big blow-up in the biggest public address journal in the country. Big blow-up there with editorial changes about this kind of bias. So it's a very open kind of field now, and one of the things that is interesting about public address, I think, is it's generally primarily oral, and it's in audiences, but now we're kind of branching out to other things. So the fact that Zelenskyy is always speaking in Ukrainian, for most of the time, sometimes he switches to different things based on what he's trying to do with his audience, makes it kind of an interesting way to branch out public address, because traditional American public address has been about presidents, or people who want to be presidents, or people who were presidents, and that's about it, really. There's a few senators in there, like, Henry Clay makes a guest appearance and stuff like this. Somebody who should have been president but wasn't, these kind of people, right? So, public address is trying to get that shared set of meanings at a national level, or at a larger organizational level, not just interpersonal. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then rhetorical criticism is the scholarly form of writing and work that we do as rhetoricians to share our views. And rhetorical criticism is the most commonly done form of scholarship in my field, where you take a speech and you either do one of these things with it. Here's how it works or fails to work. Here's how it creates meaning. How was this practice? How did it go? How did they deliver it? and here are some meanings that you might not see in there that could be there, but maybe aren't put forward. Again, it's almost like a gestalt, right? So whatever pops forward in the field of images is what's going to kind of attract your attention. So rhetorical criticism is almost an art like rhetoric itself, which is you take this speech and you say, well, let's look at it from this perspective. Let's look at it from this perspective. Here's what's missing. Who's the implied audience here? Or even more powerfully, what do the people listening to that speech want to be, if we think about it in terms of motive and attitude? Sometimes audiences want to be the kind of person the rhetor is suggesting is hearing them, because it's inspirational, and they start to move in that direction. This is where speech gets its kind of scary part. Because if you have not such a great rhetor, people are like, yeah, I'm really into that. That's a great attitude. I want to be a billionaire who can tell people off and say whatever they want and have a reality show. I don't know, I mean, that's just a random example I'm talking about. But people identify with that. They want that kind of power. And that's the kind of scary thing, is the implied auditor, like I'm doing it to you right now. I'm imagining a particular kind of student. And if you like what I'm doing, and you like what you're hearing, you are going to start to be like, yeah, this is for me. I'm this kind of person, right? You start to change your mind in very, very, very almost kind of creepy ways. Not just on my content, like understanding my language, but on who you identify as. And it can have those kind of powerful things too. So that's kind of where I'm coming from in terms of framework for this. So I have a theory of what Zelensky's doing. I'm calling existential public address. It's in the title of the thing. And existential public address is different than traditional public address in several ways. And we're going to get to this in examples. The first is that you forward and feed obliteration. So instead of saying we have this huge existential threat, it's horrible, it might wipe us out, but don't worry, we're going to beat it. That's normally what heads of state would do in this situation. But Zelenskyy is moving in a different direction because he doesn't have the rhetorical resources, or the military resources, or the financial resources, or even the allies to do it. So in order to get buy-in against Russia, he has to make this threat of obliteration scarier. He has to make all of us feel like we are implicated in this. And he's done it several times. He had one powerful speech I'm not doing tonight where he's like, ladies and gentlemen, the end of the world has arrived. Because he's trying to make this seem like this is the start of World War III. That benefits him, because then people will say, well, then it doesn't, my alliances don't matter. My economy doesn't matter if we're all going to die. I need to get involved in this war. So this is not a descriptive of the truth, it's an attempt to motivate. It's an attempt to motivate. So the existential public address strategy is to make the existential threat so big and so scary to a point where you have to get involved. It's not just Ukraine's problem, it's the world's problem. It's not just Ukraine's problem, it's Europe's problem. It's America's problem too, and Canada. Mexico's problem. It's all of us. And that's what he's trying to do. But this is a tough dance to do. Because if you make it so scary and so totalizing and so dangerous, well, then you're going to get inaction from the audience anyway. They're like, well, that's great. Thanks for letting us know. We'll be down at the pub waiting for the end. Right? Because you could go too far. You make it seem like, well, no amount of action would help this. Right? So you get that kind of doomsday thing. But then you can also get the idea of, like, even if we did our best, it wouldn't stop what's happening. So he's got to dance a fine line there. And that's a real challenge for creating the reality that you want the audience to buy into. Like, rhetoric is not really about facts and truth. Hate to say it. It's about identification, about how the audience feels. What kind of story about the world can you tell that's compelling, that will generate the kind of buy-in, the kind of action, the kind of attitude you want? That's what this art is about. The next one is familiar identities are rendered illegible. So there's a scholar in my field, I'll talk about a little bit more later, Maurice Charland, who wrote a very influential essay in rhetoric about the Quebecois separatist movement. And in that, he discussed how powerful rhetors call people into being as collectives. He called it constitutive rhetoric. So he said the way constitutive rhetoric works is that I call you into being as some kind of deep identity that you all share that you might not forward. You might not have that identity first. Like in this room, we're all products of intersectionality. Right? You're familiar with intersectionality theory. So intersectionality says you're all these things at once, and you're at the nexus and the corners of all these things at once, all these identities you share. But rhetoric and rhetors need to pull one identity forward to address, to get what they want. So calling people into being as a people, for Charland, is a timeless, like we've been here before, We'll be there again, but we have the resources as a people to deal with this. We have the resources as a people. We've been here before, do it again. So you take these familiar identities and you say, we are these people and we have no plan. We are the people and we don't know what to do. And that's what you do in existential public address, because you're trying to create a bit of anxiety. And you're trying to create a bit of a sense of trying to get in and help. But if you did that familiar, timeless thing, it would be like, well, we're going to overcome this like we have so many times in our history. No, if Zelenskyy says that, people clap and then they move on. He needs that buy-in. He needs the buy-in. So that's another thing. And then the warping of traditional and comfortable tropes. Tropes that I've already talked about, thanks for reading the book, are the things that kind of sort the universe and make us feel familiar. They make us feel like, you know, we can take a step and it works because this is the ground and the floor. It's all the things that we define as the world. These things in rhetoric are often used as comfortable kind of handholds to be able to figure out how to climb something. So if you think of tropes, you can think of like parkour. Or if you watch parkour videos on YouTube, like sometimes I might do, and I should be grading. The things that they do are incredible because they're seeing that city street or those buildings differently than I am. Right? They're looking at it differently. That's a trope. They're seeing it, oh, I can put my foot there, I can put my hand there. That's kind of how a trope works. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's like seeing it in a way to where something pops out and say, oh, look what I can do with that. Like the way an artist looks at something, the way we would just be like, oh, it's an old bag. And they're like, here we go. I sold it for $2 million. I could have done that. No, you couldn't have. Because you don't have the trope, right? You can't do it, right? So familiar tropes, like the familiar way we would think an argument would go. Arguments are funny because they're kind of like being in like in the ocean. You know, when you get into the ocean, you kind of have the waves kind of like, and you get used to that feeling. So if you're in the ocean all day and you go home, you're kind of walking around, you feel kind of weird. You still feel that motion afterwards. It's kind of like that. Argument works like that because arguments kind of naturally complete just because of the way language works. Like, what's the point at which you understand what I'm saying? Is it when I'm done with the sentence, in the middle of the sentence, or at the start of the sentence? Think about that. Try to attend to what I'm saying now. What is the point that you understand me? It's not when I'm done saying this. You understood it before I stopped speaking, just like that sentence. And this one. And this one. It gets weird. What's the point where understanding happens? There's a gap there. But that gap, it's almost like you understand me before I'm done. You know what I'm going to say. There's a slot. So this is all like deep language theory stuff. It's kind of fun to play with. We're not going to go there. But it's a fun example to think about how the familiarness of where an argument's leading you and then changing direction. Zelensky's very good at this. Very good at this. We'll see some examples of that. So this is my theory of existential public address. We'll see if it holds up. And I think my theory is the closer Zelenskyy is to these things, the more he's going to avoid the problem that he faces. Other moments of existential public address that are different. Abraham Lincoln, I might be thinking of the Gettysburg Address, probably one of the most studied speeches in history, definitely American history, but probably in history in general. Not the speech I want to talk about. I want to talk about this Cooper Union Address, which was in New York City right before the Civil War, where he said, we face the obliteration of the Union, but we have resources. We have the Constitution. And we have constitutional law. And we all stand behind that, and that's what's going to solve this problem. And everyone went, whew. So Lincoln didn't do the existential public address. It's kind of a bad example. He did traditional existential public address, which is, we face a terrible enemy, we face an unprecedented thing, but we're going to triumph. Winston Churchill, June 1940, we will fight on the beaches, right? Super famous speech, super famous. What does Churchill do in that speech? He talks about every possible scenario against the Nazis, including, this is the part of the speech I find most interesting, the obliteration of England. If they did destroy us, we'd still win because the empire would come to our aid. Oh, Churchill. Rose-colored glasses. Oh, yes, the empire you treated so well for so many years. They're going to come rushing to save you. But I mean, that's the part of the speech that got a big ovation from. So there's always a solution for Churchill and we'll fight on the beaches. So we imagine that, but there's always a solution. There's always a resource. The British people, the empire, the British way of life, the failure of them to understand what's good and true. It's all kinds of things to make you feel good. There's other examples too I could go into. These are the two most powerful, but even George W. Bush, his 9/11 speech, right? We face a terrible enemy, we know who they are, they've attacked us, they killed all this, but the solution is, what did he say? You guys remember this? Have you watched this speech? You guys were like, little tiny, but or maybe non-existent. I mean, are you ever reached the point where you were non-existent now? Like, oh my gosh, wow! It's almost time for me to join AARP. What was the solution? Americans, what you need to do to help, you need to live your lives. Oh, that's it? Yeah, live your lives. Go to the mall. Go shopping, right? The economy. It's the economy, stupid, as George Stephanopoulos said in the Bill Clinton strategy session. That became the whole focus of Bill Clinton's campaign. It's the economy, stupid. So that really made everybody feel better. Oh, I can just live my normal life. Or like Joe Biden tried to do this in his last State of the Union. He's like, everybody, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Kind of like trying to do his, goes the economy, like which became viral in one of his speeches. He tried to do that again. It didn't really work too well. It's all going to be okay. It's not specific enough. But it's that idea that Rhetoric always tries to say, we face an imperiled threat. I need these resources. You have these resources to give me. And they get that inspiration and that connection to be able to do the kind of things that Lincoln needed to do in the Civil War and that Churchill needed to do to lead Britain in World War II. Right? But Zelensky's not in his position. He's no resources. No resources. Another good example is 1983, the Korean Airline Massacre speech that Ronald Reagan gave. You might not be familiar with this speech, but in 1983, the Soviet Union shot down a fully loaded 747 Korean Airlines passenger jet, 300 people aboard, including a sitting U.S. congressperson. That's an act of war, folks. We're going to nuclear war. That's what everybody thought. It's over. We're going to war with the Soviet Union because they just shot down a jet full of Americans and South Koreans, our allies. And there was a congressman on board who they murdered. And they shut it down. They said, we thought it was a spy plane. They didn't have a very good excuse. So Reagan comes on TV. I'm going to address the nation. We're like, he's going to launch the nukes. But he came on and he said, this is awful. It's unprecedented. It's terrible. But it's expected from a culture of thoughtless, anti-civilization animals that we should continue to press into non-existence. He's like, we should expect this. And that was his solution. Which is kind of a wild thing to say. If you watch the speech, you watch it on YouTube, it's great. It's one of my favorite speeches to teach. Because it's so brilliant how he's like, we should just come to expect this kind of lawless brutality from these people who are barely human. I mean, it's just another day in the office for us. We need to wipe them off the face. And the way we're going to do that is I want Congress to fund my MX missile program. It's the new budget. I want more intercontinental nuclear missiles, and that's kind of how he speaks. It's kind of a downer, because it's like he just wants to build more missiles. So he's like, yeah, just tell your senator to vote for the MX missile, and everything will be fine. Another one. JFK, Cuban Missile Crisis. Familiar with the Cuban Missile Crisis? This is one that was more of like the threat. The threat is, we don't want to have obliteration, so I'm telling you, like, we are going to stop these ships. We don't want that nuclear disaster. We're going to stop these ships if they come any closer. It was sort of like drawing a line, being very firm. I don't really know where the Cuban Missile Crisis speech fits into my theory, quite honestly. I think it might be kind of an edge case, but it's still an interesting one that deserves some mention to think about. What do leaders do in public address situations where they are facing an existential crisis, where they literally in their government, their country, may not exist if they don't get it right? If they don't get the words right, and they don't get people to do what they do, it's over, and it's over in a big way. And that's what all these cases have in common. So, we're going to look at 3 Zelenskyy speeches tonight. The first one is the Munich Security Conference. This is on February 19th in Munich, in Germany, about European security. The next is what I call the Telegram speech. It doesn't really have an official name in the scholarship yet, but this is the address he did on a mobile phone on the network Telegram, which is a popular social media network in Russia and Ukraine. Very popular because it can be censored. I don't know if it's popular in China. I think China has its own analogs to this kind of thing, like Weibo and things like that, and WeChat and things like that, but they might use Telegram as well. It's notoriously hard. We have the computer science person in here. So it's notoriously hard for governments to block it because it's distributed, right? Kind of like distributed like torrent, like a torrent, like BitTorrent. So it's hard to block it because it comes from us. So there's reasons he gave it on Telegram and on national TV because of who he wanted to reach. And then the last speech I'm going to cover is his address to the U.S. Congress, which he did by Zoom, like all of us now, even leaders of countries at war have to speak by Zoom. There he's addressing the assembled Congress in the official congressional Zoom chamber. I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what they do with our money? And I'm looking at these 3, and I thought, what's an interesting thing I could bring as another theoretical perspective on top of this? And I thought about the Triptych, which is familiar to those of you who study art, familiar with art. The Triptych is such an interesting way to do an art piece. I thought, well, no one's really applied the Triptych to rhetoric before, so I thought I might do it. I found this great quote from this artist, South African artist, about what a triptych is. And let me read it to you, although you could read. Firstly, you have a series of images of the same place, but each is different because that space is occupied by a different centerpiece each time. I think that applies. So we have the same kind of situation, but a different centerpiece, a different audience maybe, a different objective, a different kind of thing. I thought it kind of applied. Time has passed between each image. Objects have been rearranged. Even the viewpoint has changed slightly. I think that's true between February 19th, 24th, and then in March when he addressed the Congress. Yeah, so the narrative comes from the audience. The narrative comes from the audience. So let's look at some of these examples and kind of talk about how the triptych might help us frame what's going on here. And we'll watch some clips. Let's watch some clips. Uh-oh. Or not. Does anybody know what I might be doing wrong?
I think you might be offline because it's indicating that you're working offline.
Oh.
So maybe having to reconnect to the Wi-Fi.
Oh, I am. That's weird. Sorry about this, folks.
It's okay.
Every address. U.S. Congressman. I think when he spoke to U.S. Congress, he was in invocation.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Why is that? It's not the military, that's a military. Military stuff.
All right, let's watch this clip and then I'll make a couple comments about it.
Україна хоче миру. Європа хоче миру. Світ каже, що не хоче воювати. А Росія, що не хоче нападати. Хтось з нас бреше. Це ще не аксіома, але вже не гіпотеза. Пані та панове, 2 дні тому я був на Донбасі. На лінії розмежування юридично між Україною і тимчасово окупованими територіями. Фактично розмежування між миром і війною. Де з одного боку дитячий садочок, а з іншого снаряд, що влучив в нього. З одного боку школа, а з іншого снаряд, що прилітає на шкільний двір. А поруч 30 дітей, які йдуть, ні, не в НАТО, а на уроки, до школи. У когось фізика. Знаючи її елементарні закони, навіть діти розуміють, наскільки безглуздо звучать заяви про те, що обстріли ведуться з боку України. У когось математика. Діти, звичайні діти, без калькулятора можуть порахувати різницю між кількістю обстрілів у ці останні 3 дні і згадками про Україну у цьогорічному Munich Security Report. А у когось дітей історія. І коли на шкільному підвір'ї з'являється воронка, від бомби у дітей з'являється питання, невже світ забув свої помилки ХХ століття? До чого призводять спроби умиротворення? Як питання, навіщо вмирати за Данциг, обернулося необхідністю вмирати за Дюнкерк і за десятки інших міст Європи і світу, ціною у десятки мільйонів життів. Це страшні уроки історії. Я лише хочу переконати, що ми всі з вами читали одні й ті ж самі книжки. А отже, однаково розуміємо відповідь на головне питання. Як так сталося? Що у 21 столітті в Європі знову йде війна і гинуть люди. Чому вона триває довше, ніж Друга світова війна? Як ми дійшли до найбільшої безпекової кризи з часів Холодної війни?
All right, a lot going on in that clip. And you can see kind of how he's already kind of playing with your expectations in a way of what you might say at the security conference. Where he sets up all of these contrasts, which would be an invitation for a rhetoric to cut through, to say there are bombs in the schoolyard, these students go to class, but there are explosions, there's shooting, even they understand it's ridiculous going to the basic classes. So it's sort of conflating things that should be quite separate. And he's playing on it instead of saying it's going to be okay. He says it's absolutely not okay. Do we read the same books? These students understand the lessons of the 20th century. How come we don't here at the Munich Security Conference? The second thing is he conflates the Russians and NATO and Europe in this wonderful opening, where he's like, you say you want peace, they say you want peace. Somebody in this room is lying. So he's automatically accusing everybody as being in on it, which is not the typical thing you would do when you're invited to come and speak to a security conference as a member who would have a vested interest in it. He's trying to create that threat and make it larger than life in a way, to where everyone realizes we can't do the same things. And I think it's pretty effective. It's kind of scary what he's talking about. And he's saying, look how quickly we must die for this, we must die for this, at the cost of millions of lives. World War II is not that far away. In fact, he even blurs it further and says, why is World War II lasting so long? Invalidating the UN, invalidating the peace treaty, saying, look, it's still going on. Go to Donbass with me. Donbass is the demarcation line at the, the Budapest Memorandum, which is the end of hostilities of Crimea between Russia and, remember when the Russians came in 2014 and took half the country? Yeah, that's the demarcation line of like the occupied territories, or as the Russians call the liberated territories, or the free states, or whatever they call them, I forget. But that's kind of interesting what he's doing. So I think there's a lot going on there that shows this kind of existential rhetoric, or existential public interest. So, that's the first.
Україна хоче миру. Європа хоче миру.
Let me show you, in the interest of time here, because I lost my timer, so I don't know how long I've been going. But I don't want to talk too long. Let's watch another clip from the Munich speech here at the end.
Для мене, як для президента країни, що втратила частину своїх територій, тисячі людей, і біля кордонів якої зараз стоїть як зброя. Всі ці питання потребують відповідей. І поки замість них тиша. І поки буде тиша, тиші не буде на Сході як зброя. Всі ці питання потребують відповідей.
So this silence theme comes up in the Telegram speech, which we'll look at next, so keep that in mind. This idea of we need speech, but there's silence. He'll use this again in his next speech too. Interesting theme he uses.
Поки замість них тиша. І поки буде тиша, тиші не буде на Сході нашої держави, на Сході України, тобто у Європі, тобто у цілому світі. Сподіваюсь, це нарешті розуміє весь світ, розуміє Європу. Пані та панове, я дякую всім державам, які сьогодні підтримали Україну. І словом, і деклараціями, і конкретикою, конкретною допомогою. Тим, хто сьогодні на нашій стороні, на стороні правди, на стороні міжнародного права. Я не називаю наших друзів поіменно, не хочу, аби деяким іншим країнам сьогодні було соромно. Але це їх справа, це їх держави, це їх карма, це на їх совісті. Щоправда, не знаю, як вони зможуть пояснити свої дії двом вбитим.
Okay, so that clip is really interesting. It goes on a little bit longer, but it's interesting how he's blurring all these connections. So these states that don't support us, how can they explain those actions to people killed today? So he takes the large, moves it to the small. This is a traditional rhetorical move, going from the larger to the smaller for contrast, which creates powerful meaning. They might be able to justify their actions here at the conference, but what will they say to these people who have lost their father, these children who lost their father in the show today? The other thing he said, he's like, I'm not going to mention those who won't support us. I don't want them to feel ashamed, which is a way of shaming them, because everybody knows who the countries are. So it's a wonderful way of admission without doing it. It's a wonderful rhetorical move he's doing there too. And I also think there's this other move he makes, which he does in all his speeches, of making Ukraine and Europe simultaneous, right? This is a rhetorical strategy of synecdoche. The synecdoche is the part standing in for the whole. So if this violence and attack on a state is allowed in Ukraine, which is democracy, there's no hope for Europe. In fact, this is an attack on Europe. I don't know if you guys saw on Instagram the Ukrainian government's deepfake of the attack, where they made a video of an attack on Paris, the way Kiev is being attacked. It looks very realistic. I'll show it to you if you're interested in the end. But it's a very realistic attack on Paris. Like, imagine if this was happening anywhere other than Kiev or in any other European capital. What would the response be? Powerful argument. But that kind of argument is like to get that fear going, that kind of existential fear going that he's so good. I think. So takeaways from Munich. I think this is the most powerful one. Blurring those familiar identities, Europe and Ukraine, individuals and states, aggressors and bombs and school children, all of these things. Peacetime and wartime get blurred. We're still in World War II apparently. The entire security apparatus of the Western world has failed. It no longer works. Expand and enhance the threat. Europe is being attacked, not Ukraine. The security order of the 20th century is being attacked. And the things that we thought generate peace are being attacked. And then underwhelming simplicity and overarching complexity. It's so simple to understand. Like at the end he talks about how the one guy who was killed by a mortar, he understood what needed to be done. How come we in this room can't? How come we in this room can't? So there's so simplicity. Why is it so complex? We just need to act and create a security alliance that functions. So let's talk about the Telegram speech a little bit. This speech was put on social media network Telegram on February 24th, hours before the Russians attacked. Zelenskyy put it on Telegram, which looks like this, in order to reach the Russian people. That's his audience. But we want to be careful when rhetorics say who their audience is. They might want to use a strategy, and I think this is kind of an interesting strategy, being overheard. So there's a great popularity in our culture now of the open letter. People are always writing an open letter to, and it's like a private communication meant for others to read. And I think that's what Zelensky's doing here. And that's kind of a more traditional rhetorical appeal. But let's watch a little of this and talk about it, then we'll move on to the last example. So.
А дальше по-русски. Сегодня я инициировал телефонный разговор с президентом Российской Федерации. Результат – тишина. Хотя тишина должна быть на Донбассе. Поэтому сегодня я хочу обратиться ко всем гражданам России. Не как президент. Я обращаюсь к российским гражданам как гражданин Украины. С вами нас разделяет более 2000 километров общей границы. Вдоль нее сегодня стоят ваши войска, почти 200 тысяч солдат, 1000 боевых машин. Ваше руководство одобрило их шаг вперед на территорию другой страны. И этот шаг может стать началом большой войны на европейском континенте. О том, что может произойти со дня на день, сегодня говорит весь мир. Причина может возникнуть в любой момент. Любая провокация, любая вспышка. Вспышка, которая может сжечь все. Вам говорят, что это пламя принесет освобождение народу Украины. Но украинский народ свободен. Он помнит о своем прошлом и сам строит свое будущее. Строит, а не разрушает. Как рассказывают вам каждый день по телевизору. Украина в ваших новостях и Украина в реальной жизни – это две совершенно разные страны. И главное, их отличие в том, что наши настоящие.
All right, so that's a very powerful opening, I think. There's a lot going on there too. A couple of highlights to think about is, I tried to speak as a president to your president and got silence. So maybe if I change tactics, a citizen to the citizens, maybe something can happen. And why am I speaking to you? We have this shared thing that is about to ignite and burn everything down. So this is global in scope, this is everything. Maybe even beyond global. All of the hopes of the 20th century, all the hopes of Pax Americana and all the philosophies of foreign policy, everything. Because your leadership is moving to this and you don't understand this is happening. Because you're being lied to, you're being misrepresented. So, I mean, I don't know if he's really addressing the Russians here, but this is a nice framing for us to understand the situation and for people who could help the Ukrainians, if the Russian citizens couldn't. It's an amazing framing for us as well. And it's also the same thing of like blurring those familiar identities. I'm a president and a citizen. You're a citizen, but you're also responsible. And then who are we listening to? What's our identity here? Who are we supposed to be? We are indicted as part of it, but we can't really do that much about it. We you can just sit kind of fearful. So here's the existential threat becoming global again.
А дальше по-русски. Сегодня я инициировал телефонный разговор с президентом России. Вам говорят, что мы нацисты. Но разве может поддерживать нацизм народ, который за победу над нацизмом отдал больше 8 миллионов жизней? Как могу быть нацистом я? Расскажите об этом моему деду, который прошел всю войну в пехоте советской армии, а умер полковник в независимой Украине. Вам говорят, что мы ненавидим русскую культуру. Как можно ненавидеть культуру? Любую культуру. Соседи всегда обогащают друг друга культурно, однако это не делает их единым целым, не растворяет нас в вас. Мы разные, но это не повод быть врагами. Мы хотим сами определять и строить свою историю мирно, спокойно, честно. Вам говорили, что я прикажу наступать на Донбасс, стрелять, бомбить без вопросов. Хотя вопросы есть и очень простые. Стрелять в кого? Что бомбить? Донецк, в котором я бывал десятки раз. Видел лица, глаза. Артема, по которой я гулял с друзьями. Донбасс-арену, где болел с местными за наших украинских пацанов на евро. Парк Щербакова, где мы вместе выпивали, когда наши пацаны проиграли. Луганск, дом, где живет мать моего лучшего друга. Место, где похоронен отец моего лучшего друга.
So this is a traditional rhetorical strategy called the enthymeme. Aristotle identified this thousands of years ago, where you ask questions to the audience that encourage an answer. You become part of the creation of the discourse. In this case, this is a warped kind of enthymeme. It's a warped, familiar kind of argument because the answers are so horrible you don't really want to provide them. You feel kind of shamed that this is the argument that's being made. So it's like you're calling us Nazis, but how can we be Nazis when my grandfather fought the Nazis and survived that horrible war? World War II means something very different to Ukrainians and Russians than it does for us. Very different. The amount of lives lost, the way the fighting was, is a very, very different thing. So speaking about this kind of stuff is very heavy for that audience. And then, oh, I'm supposed to be bombing these places? What, my best friend's father's grave? The place where I go and watch soccer? It almost seems ludicrous to answer these questions, which is kind of a shameful tactic. It's not a traditional kind of enthymeme. It's an enthymeme that makes you feel ashamed to participate. It makes you feel ashamed that these are the claims the opposition's making. I think it's a very powerful twist on the classical enthymeme argument, which is an argument that the audience usually completes. So a traditional enthymeme would be like, is that what you really want your tax money to go for? And everyone's of course like, well, no, of course not, right? That's what everyone's thinking. But that way they participate in the argument, they're less likely to go against you. Zelensky's kind of twisting that in his kind of, in these existential interviews. I'm not going to make the same mistake I do every time.
Вам говорят, что мы нацисты.
It still happened. Okay.
Но разве?
Sorry, guys. I think we'll skip this last part so we can move on to the
Заметьте, я говорю сейчас.
last bit here, if it will let me. Okay, so the last part is the one that we do. So 3 things to take away from this one, which I think is also a powerful speech. I think the Munich speech is probably the best example of how to create that kind of threat, how to make those identities, those old identities, feel insufficient, to get new buy-in and new construction of new identities and new ways to move forward to offer a solution to the existential threat. So, disordered leadership. I am a citizen and the president, but I can't speak like a president. So here I come on social media as a Ukrainian citizen. Weird, right? Imagine if Joe Biden had to do that. It's like, I'm coming to you tonight on Twitter because the media has been censored by whoever's taking us over. It's weird to think about, right? But he handles it extremely well. He handles it extremely well. Enthymeme, but make it shameful, right? This is kind of like the TikTok challenge, right? So it's an enthymeme where you're kind of willing to complete the argument, but you feel so dirty and gross completing the argument. You're like, that's like so horrible and obvious I can't even say it, right? and then the synecdoche of the people. So the clip that I didn't show you is where he's talking about what does war affect the most? The people. Who doesn't want war? People. Who can stop the people? So who's he talking? This shared border idea of you're on one side of the border and I'm not, but we both love each other's culture, we're enriching each other. It's impossible for anyone to hate a culture. That doesn't make any sense. So we can throw that argument away. We're just the people, and it's going to hurt us. So who is he calling on to take action? The people are harmed, the people don't want it. It's not enough to say Ukraine doesn't want it. It's not enough to say the Russian people don't want it. That's not going to get the buy-in he needs. He faces a serious aporia here, which is, if he's successful, he becomes a wonderful symbol of fighting for freedom against oppressive nation-state action. But no one's going to help him. They just shed a tear and clap. Like you can already see like Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. Bravo! He's a hero. And then they do nothing. Then he ends up dying anyway. And Ukraine doesn't exist anyway. That's the stakes. So he can't fall into that trap. This is the aporia, because that's what we expect the argument to be like. These two speeches are not like this. This is somebody who's kind of angry. This is somebody who's kind of upset. This is somebody who's kind of buying in at a certain level to make us feel ashamed and feel guilty and feel bad about what's going on, even though we're not really in charge of it, but he wants us to think that we are. That's what he's trying to get. This is the existential public address twist over the traditional kind of like, we shall overcome kind of rhetoric, which is not going to help him or Ukraine. So he's kind of lost the thread, unfortunately. In the congressional speech, he kind of loses the thread and says a couple of weird things. This is a weird example. I don't really know what he's doing. I think he may be tired of his every elected house in the world tour. I wonder if they'll make a shirt. I don't know. But let's look at some of the congressional speech, which is a very, very different. And I wonder if you'll notice the contrast I noticed from it.
Presidents, those who laid the foundation of the United States of America as it is today, democracy, independence, freedom, and care for everyone, for every person, for everyone who works diligently,
Okay?
who lives honest, who respects the law. We in Ukraine want the same for our people. All that is normal part of your own life. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, Americans, in your great history, you have pages that would allow you to understand Ukrainian, understand us now, when you need it right now, when we need you right now. Remember Pearl Harbor, terrible morning of December 7, 1941, when your sky was black from the planes attacking you. Just remember it. Remember September the 11th, a terrible day in 2001 when evil tried to turn your cities, independent territories, in battlefields, when innocent people were attacked from air, yes, just like no one else expected it. You could not stop it. Our country experienced the same every day, right now, at this moment, every night, for 3 weeks now. Various Ukrainian cities, Odessa and Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Sumy, Zhytomyr and Lviv, Mariupol and Dnipro. Russia has turned the Ukrainian sky into a source of death for thousands of people. Russian troops have already fired nearly 1,000 missiles at Ukraine, countless bombs. They use drones to kill us with precision. This is a terror that Europe has not seen for 80 years, and we are asking for a reply, for an answer to this terror from the whole world. Is this a lot to ask for, to create a no-fly zone over Ukraine to save people? Is this too much to ask? Humanitarian no-fly zone, something that that Russia will not be able to terrorize our free cities. Impotence, those who laid the foundation of the United.
Okay, so in this clip, I'll go ahead and stop it there because he starts to move towards the role of the president, the role of the U.S. government here. And what's interesting about this is this nice conflation, which fits with my theory, which is civilian, the peaceful, the cities, turning civilian sites into battlefields, and that conflation. Like, You don't want your cities turned into battlefields like the Russians are doing. This has happened to you before, twice, 2 big examples. It's exactly the way it's happened in Ukraine now. It came from the sky, nobody could predict it, it killed thousands of people. Same situation we're in now, and you rose up to stop it. We want to rise up to stop it now, so give us a no-fly zone. Now this is the problem I think that we have with this, is he asks for a very specific policy solution without constituting the threat of like, well, this could happen again. The cadence I feel in that is that we go from Pearl Harbor to September 11th to what's next, and he doesn't do that. He says, look, you've been here, you were able to stop it, help us stop it. And I just don't think it's strong enough to get American buy-in. I think he's kind of like maybe losing the thread of what's powerful about the existential public address that he did in the last 2 speeches. It's a real shift. The other thing he said in the rest of the clip, which I think is interesting, is he's not drawing on the traditional, like, you need to do this to defend the women, the children, the mothers, human rights, all these kind of vague things that good Western elected officials always praise, right? We must defend human rights. Every child has a right to grow up and be, this kind of stuff. He's very specific. He says, you enjoy freedoms from a nation state that defends its borders. American freedom comes from a country that defends its borders. September 11th, Pearl Harbor. You rose up, you defended your borders, and we want the same thing. We want people to enjoy legal rights. That's what he says. So this is a really weird twist. It's not the vague appeal to protecting humanity or to going up against a crime against humanity. It's this really wonderful appeal to, you have a particular legal structure bound in a nation-state theory that you defend. We want the same thing. So that's what relates us. It's a strange argument. But I think these existential moments require this kind of strange argument. Because that's not something we would be used to hearing in normal circumstances. We'd be like, oh yeah, human rights. We got to defend that. No, he's not saying. He's like, a legal structure based on your borders, defending your borders is what we want to defend and what we want to protect. Then he moves on to talking about, wow, okay. So maybe I'll just finish it here. He moves on to talk about what he wants to do. Is he says, the United Nations has failed, they refuse to act. NATO refuses to act. All security alliances are done. This proves that every security alliance is over. This is scary stuff to hear. Especially if you're a student of this stuff and you're like, wow, most of human history is people killing each other for thousands and thousands of years over war over territory. And we haven't had that in a long time. It's scary to hear that NATO's inert, the United Nations can't do what it says in its charter. It even says a founding member of the United Nations can't even rely on the United Nations for protection, Ukraine, right? So it's like you can't even do it, right? So we need a new, then he says all this, which should make everyone think, well, we really need to scramble, we really need to act in whatever ways we can. But then he says what we need is a new organization, United U-24, which will have the resources to move in any conflict and in 24 hours end it. And Ukraine wants to start this, we hope you'll join us. It's strange. I don't understand why he does that. But he does it in this speech, and it's just, it even feels like the wind is coming out of the sails. You can feel the balloon deflating even when I heard it. I was like, that's very odd. It didn't go with what I thought he was doing at all. So maybe he's sort of turning a corner. Maybe he thinks that, I don't know what he thinks, but it's obvious he thinks he's turning a corner and that these specific policy recommendations, like no-fly zone and a new international organization, are the things that are going to get the buy-in to where he's going to get access to what he needs to win the war against Russia. Maybe. I can't speak to his mind. But it's a real change in his address from the Munich Security Conference and definitely from Telegram, where it's up to the people to find innovative and new ways to address this situation. So that's what I wanted to share. Sorry about the technology, but we can talk about it or look at any other clips that you want. But it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here. I would hope he doesn't go towards the more specific policy recommendations, that's my view. I like the more existential threat kind of anxiety generating stuff. I think he's very good at that. But yeah, that's what I wanted to share. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Let's give our speaker a round of applause. And let's open to questions. And I'd like to give the first shot of questions to any guests, any non-members of Wisconsin Speech and Debate who joined us. Is there questions from any of you first? First shot questions for our guests? Yes, please, record.
Professor, I'm just wondering, you mentioned like in your introduction with rhetorical criticism, there's a lot, I think there was a lot of parallels to like film criticism, because like, a speech is meant to be overheard in some sense, and it's not necessarily for the audience, it's every speech in a film is meant to be overheard.
Sure.
And we're always talking about, what kind of meaning is being created, how well it's being created, we give awards for best actor and stuff. So I'm just wondering, is there a tradition in rhetorical criticism that's ties into film, or is that just?
Yeah, there's a lot of rhetorical criticism with film. Film is kind of an interesting case study in university politics because the attacks in the 1980s and 90s on the canon of literature, which old white English-speaking dudes, right? Like, oh, this is not literature, eviscerated that. So now there's no canon in literature. Or if you're an English major, you know this, that canon is always being debated. So film has kind of entered that. But I have a lot of colleagues who study film. I have one colleague who studies horror film in particular, writes books about horror film and how it works from a rhetorical point of view and does rhetorical criticism of that. Marvel films, lots of people write about Marvel films, I'm going to get it, I'm not a fan, I'm going to sound like an idiot, so I'm going to get it wrong. Black Panther, is that a Marvel film? Oh, thank God. So Black Panther had a lot of attention. I mean, I haven't seen it, I don't know what it's about. But it got a lot of attention in terms of rhetorical criticism, people writing about that, in terms of Afrofuturism, Afro-fantasy futurisms, and things like that, which I think is great stuff. I'm familiar with that theory, but I guess I need to watch these superhero movies. Kind of reticent. But yeah, there's a tradition of that. I think any text you can approach from rhetorical criticism. So you can do architecture, you can do film. A lot of people do that. So yeah, great question.
To segue off of that, discussion of film. Maybe I'm being stupid, I believe this real quick. Zelenskyy was an actor before
That's right.
president as well. Do you think his experience as an actor shaped his rhetorical style here? Do you know of his background in that at all, or how that might have?
Yeah, so he's an interesting case as an actor because he's a native Russian speaker. There's a part in the Telegram speech where he switches to Russian. And he has this powerful moment where he says, now I'm speaking to you in Russian, but no Russian can understand me. And it's a play on words, which is I'm talking about Ukrainian issues in your language, and you still don't understand. So why are you in support of this attack? You have no idea what you're fighting for, even in your own language. You don't get it. So it's a really nice moment in this speech. I think his acting, he's a comedy actor. There's a famous quote, I can't remember who said it. I want to say it was like a Barrymore or something, just like on their deathbed, it was like, oh, are you feeling okay? And they're like, oh, it's okay, dying is easy, comedy is hard. Which I think this quote really applies to Zelensky's position, right? So I think he's able to convey a lot of things. And there might be an interesting study to do looking at him and Reagan. Because Reagan was a comedy actor too. Ronald Reagan, before he got into politics, was famous for making a series of movies about a monkey. I'm not making this up, a monkey named Bonzo. Bonzo is a chimpanzee. These are like real life Curious George movies. I don't know if you've ever seen one. So like, big hit, Bedtime for Bonzo. And it's always the same plot every time. Ronald Reagan would be put in charge of this chimpanzee. And he'd be like, I'll make sure Bonzo doesn't get in any trouble. And he turns his back for 5 minutes and Bonzo has like destroyed the bedroom and he's jumping around, throwing the pillows. And then Ronald Reagan would come in and be like, Bonzo, what are you doing? Like everybody laughs. This is how Reagan became famous. So Zelenskyy was famous for a show called Servant of the People, which is a Ukrainian television show about a high school teacher who becomes the president of Ukraine. So, experience. He wasn't, but it's on Netflix now. They put it on Netflix so everybody can watch it. But this is the problem. I want to show this last slide actually because I forgot I put it in here. This is the problem Zelenskyy faces, right? So there's soon to possibly be second-term French president Emmanuel Macron? Question mark. This kind of like Zelenskyy cosplay thing. Like what is this? He showed up unshaven in a French paratrooper's hoodie and jeans and to work. And it's like he's in an election year, right? So this is obviously a PR stunt. So this is the aporia Zelenskyy faces, right? So he's a very good job as an actor. This is probably his face after seeing this picture. He's like, I haven't slept in 2 days. Like, what are you doing? You have all the cheese you want, wine, and all this stuff. So what are you doing, right? So this is what we want to avoid, is this kind of like aporia where it's like, yeah, I stand with him, but I don't have to do anything. Because he's such a powerful symbol, right? And you see Macron is kind of leaning on that for his election that, well, after yesterday's debate, looks pretty good, but according to the polls, but you never know, the fascists might still win. Yeah.
So in that one of the speeches, he referenced Pearl Harbor, and then he's
been doing this a lot, where he's like referencing the specific country's history, like he did this with Israel, where he was like,
Yep.
remember where we were? Do you think that that's effective? Because it seems to be drifting away from the existential rhetoric thing that you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm worried about that. I mean, I think, so with Israel, it's an interesting case because of Zelensky's Jewish background. And I think the idea, the Russians have used a huge amount of anti-Semitic stuff against him and all this, saying he's actually a Nazi and all this stuff and anything. So it's sort of like, there's a lot of comparison there with like, at first I thought, we talked about this, I kind of thought it was a 6-day war kind of situation going on here. We could rely on this Israeli kind of tropes or Israeli rhetoric. But he's not really doing it. He's using it kind of as an example to say, well, this is your history, He's trying his best to say, Ukrainian history is your history. But it's not a powerful way of doing it. Like he referenced the "We will fight on the beaches" speech when he addressed the parliament, right? And that's a good, I mean, it's great. Like Aristotle said, it's easy to praise Athens in front of Athenians. He wrote that in one of his books, like, easiest job in the world. Athens is great, philosophy and thought. And the Athenians are like, yes, wise words, this kind of thing. So there might be some kind of pandering, but there are better ways of referencing that and better connections between Zelensky, Ukraine, and Israel's history that I think would really motivate the Israeli government to do more, which is what he wants. Just like he could with America or Canada or the UK. But he's making the comparison, I think, too tightly. Instead of like saying, but look, and Israel's a great case for this because Israel's always under threat, right? They're always under threat, so it's a lot easier to make that connection with the Israeli government to say, you understand this better than any other democracy in the world. You're always under threat from your neighbors. You're always aware. We have the same sort of situation, but we're protecting all of Europe and the rest of the world, right? We're not just protecting Ukrainians, we're protecting the world, protecting you as well. So you can do, that would have been a better way to do it, in my opinion. But I don't know, I mean, there's also, foreign policy is tough, right? So there's a lot of things you can't say. That's a great question. The Israel connection, I think, is one really worth looking into very deeply. And Arnold Schwarzenegger did a similar kind of telegram speech where he talked about that connection a bit. I don't know if you saw that one, but that was kind of wild.
Given that this is like a 20-minute speech from a politician in another country, how many people do you think realistically watch them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think most people consume political speeches through their media, their journalism of choice. I don't know, with the internet and with younger people, you guys consume news very differently than I do as a Gen X person. You see clips, some clips turn viral, they go around, but I wonder if it's necessary to see the entire speech anymore to really get it. I like looking at the whole thing just to see what's there. But the situation is very different. I wonder about that. I mean, I think you maybe only need to see, like I only showed you some clips of it, and I think you're kind of getting what's going on. But that's also a selection and deflection of other things that can be happening. But I think it's a good question. I don't think you need to see the whole thing to really get a lot of what's going on. But it's also a part of the mean, right? So the master unit of meaning in society these days is the mean, not just like, not just like memes, right? But those are part of it too. But it's little clips that stand in for so much. Or little images that stand like SpongeBob, I can't do it. But these things stand in for so much, right? And they have such communicative power and international, intercultural force. So maybe speeches are consumed the way we consume all relevant information, which is through the meme, is the way we mostly make arguments and speak to each other these days. That's it.
Yeah, so first, thank you so much for the amazing presentation. You went into depth about, I guess, his words and how he used rhetoric to really, I guess, maximize his impact and influence. I was wondering what was your opinion about his actions, in particular, how that really impacts his rhetoric and how he's perceived by the people. What I'm trying to say is, like, most notably, yeah, I think he stayed in Kyiv, even though, like, the U.S. embassy and those people wanted him evacuated, but he stayed there. I thought that really, like, made him more powerful, and also at the same time, using, like, the 3 speeches that you gave here today, he was in suits for 2 of them, but in front of the U.S. Congress, he actually donned a military T-shirt.
Yep.
I was wondering what was your opinion about that?
Yeah, he's changed his attire. He no longer has access to, I think, dry cleaning. I think he's just wearing the military, since the war he's been wearing that military shirt. That's saying that, but it's kind of become symbolic. Like all the drawings of him, it's that gray, that kind of green-gray military shirt. It's kind of very symbolic. Macron's trying to capitalize on that here with some French nationalism, I think. Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't know if I can speak to his actions, but as a rhetorician, I speak to perception of action. So if he's forwarding a particular action, it has meaning for the audience. it's always communicated through rhetorical frames. So the most, I'll reenact it here, right? So the most famous recent one is him giving a press conference, and then at the end of it, he goes, right? Do you remember this? Why did he do that? You guys know? Yeah?
Because Putin made a video that, like, Putin was, oh, here, hey, I'm here, I'm like staying safe, I'm not scared. And then you can see in the video that his hand goes through the microphone.
Yes, right.
So that's showing that this was a fake video.
Yeah, he's green screened it.
Yeah.
So he's green screened it, so Zelenskyy does that. Right? Zelenskyy also does this thing where he winks at the camera a lot. Like after he'll say something like, he was like, hey, I'm in my office. Like, I mean, if you're at war and the Russians are storming the thing, why would you go to your office? It's like the first place that they're going to come and look for you, right? So he's like, hey, I'm in my office, I'm not leaving. I'm here working. And then he's like, you know. So this is like the kind of action that rhetoricians look at, is this kind of idea of like, what's being communicated there? Like, it's not just the facts or the reasons or the arguments. It's the modality, how he's doing it, slapping the microphone around. Like, it's like, he's like symbolically slapping Putin around. Right? It's kind of what he's doing, right? He's like, come here. Winking at the camera, he's like about to be bombed. He's like completely, cool as a cucumber. It's wild. So this is the kind of action that rhetoricians are in. As far as policy stuff goes, I don't really comment on that very much. I don't really study it. That'd be more like political science might do that. But for rhetoric, it's more about how do we communicate that policy to the people, and how does that create the reality? Because you can have, a tax bill in this country could be 4,000 pages or something. I don't know what they are. They're very long. Even a state tax bill. And it's just about who can control the microphone and who can control people through those clips is going to tell you what that tax bill is and what it means, right? And you can look to Florida for all kinds of examples of that, recent policies that DeSantis is doing that are a little bit wild, but great fodder for rhetoricians. But maybe not so great for citizens, in my opinion.
So you talked a little bit about how now we've got this kind of soundbite culture where everyone just looks for the headline. And I think what you're saying is he's doing a really effective job at getting those sound bites and fitting a lot into a little space. But as I know you've studied the history of rhetoric, and like for example, the Gettysburg Address was a couple minutes long, right?
Right, very short.
It could be similar in that sense, where you have a couple really brief but really impactful statements. And I also know that on that same day, there was a keynote speaker who wasn't Abraham Lincoln, who was Edward Everett, and he gave like a 2-hour-long speech.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Those kind of speeches are throughout history. If you've studied them, do they look different in terms of content, or is it just a lot more bullshit for a lot longer?
That's great. So I'll give my opinion, but let me just kind of give a caveat first, which is in rhetoric, the only thing that really matters to us is what the audience thinks. The audience is the only arbiter of the value of a speech, which is scary, and as scary as it is true. Because the rhetor wants audience to do something, believe something, feel something, change something, believe something. So in order to say a speech is effective, I can take a philosophical point of view as a philosopher and say, that speech was effective because it was so true and factual, all these people are too stupid to understand it. And then we're like, yay, right? But what does that get us, right? But that's the philosopher's point of view, right? The rhetorician's point of view is like, well, you might as well not have said it. You have to adapt it in ways that are ethical, that keep with what you want to say, but in ways the audience can understand. And that's where the ethical compulsion lies of good speaking is, did I give the audience the best shot to understand my point of view that I possibly could? Do I understand their position and culture? I don't have to agree with it, but can I use that? Can I use what they bring in the room, like a potluck dinner, to make a really nice feast, right? Can I do that? And that's where the ethical compulsion for a rhetorician lies, or for a rhetorical critic, is like, did they do the best job of offering that idea to the audience in a way they could actually understand it? If you do it in a way where they couldn't understand it, then then you might as well not speak. But in some disciplines, that's fine, because that's the truth. So in rhetoric, we have this kind of floating kind of sense of, well, the truth is in effect, audience things happen. So with that in mind, I would say the speeches of the 19th century are wonderful and great, but you have to get in a 19th century mentality for that kind of thing, where you don't have a laptop, you don't have the internet, you don't have television, you don't even have recording technology. If you want to hear music, someone has to play it on a piano. Right? That's a different world. You have readings, so there's these images from the 19th century where someone would go and paint. It's like VR, Oculus. Have you guys played with this? It's wild, right? I just played with it in the fall for the first time. It's wild. Like I'm like, oh, Everest Base Camp, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna die. Take it off quick. But they had a 19th century version of this where they go paint like Versailles and just paint around. And you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and see this, and you're just like, what is this? You're just in this room and you're like, yeah, there's Versailles. I mean, this would be the equivalent of 19th century VR. And for them, it was overwhelming. People would line up and pay a lot of money to go have this experience because they're never going to get to France. It's like a very dangerous boat trip. Even on a steamer, it takes a long time to get to Europe. And it's dangerous. And then when you get over there, everyone in your family thinks you died until you spend the money to send a telegram back to say, I made it. And like, thank God. Like, it's just a very different world. So you have to kind of put yourself in that mentality to appreciate it. But Lincoln, speaking of Lincoln versus Everett, Lincoln is very much like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson hated public speaking, never did it, didn't ever want to do it, sat quietly and doodled and wrote his little book and humming to himself. Weird guy. And when he was president, he only spoke maybe like 3 or 4 times. When he gave State of Union, he did it in the Senate chamber. Because he's like, well, it's not really for the public, it's for the Congress. And Lincoln is kind of like this. Lincoln was a lawyer, but it's better to maybe think of in that British tradition of law, Lincoln would have been more of a solicitor than a barrister. Like he really kind of liked the argument and stuff, but he wasn't, we think of him as a great speaker because of his intellect. Most of his speeches were like, the occasion demands I say a few words, so I shall. The words I will say is this. Thank you. And that's what he would do, right? He's very like matter of fact kind of guy. Gettysburg Address is very, very Lincoln and very, very odd. But there's more books on that than any other speech, I think, in American history. Or maybe even in European history, I don't know. I mean, you have people like Gladstone and stuff like that in the British tradition. You have Irish speakers who are quite powerful. And then you have all the non-English speakers from all of European history. Especially the Italians, they have a lot of public address history as well. But a lot of that has been ignored by the Americentrism and Anglocentrism of rhetorical scholars. But there's plenty of stuff to look at in the US. But I would say, trying to put yourself in the mindset of someone in the 19th century is exceedingly difficult. But the way they would appreciate a speech by Everett would be fine to them. They wouldn't think of it as excessive. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, I know I'm going on too long, but the Lincoln-Douglas debates, those were structured in such an odd way to where they would question each other. So Senator Douglas would get up and ask Lincoln a question for 30, 45 minutes. Then Lincoln would have 2 hours to respond. Not 2 hours to come up with it, 2 hours of speaking. Right? Because the time frame is different. People would come out with cotton candy and hot dogs. So it's an event, because you never get to see this kind of thing. At one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas asks a question, and Lincoln says, I would love to answer this question, but I need to check something first. So if you don't mind, I would like to go to the library and do a little research, and I'll be back in maybe an hour. Is that amenable to you, Senator Douglas? He says, that would be fine. And everybody agreed, so everybody left. And then they came back in an hour, he went to the library, did a little research, came back and said, okay, I looked up the answer, I had to look up a historical detail, but now I'm fine answering the senator's question. What the hell? Like, think about the last presidential debate people would never fly. Let's take a commercial break, I gotta look up something on my phone. They would instantly be disqualified. Because you have to have an instant response. Why? Why? It's because the media is controlling what we consider to be, and it's the same thing in the 19th century. The media is mostly newsprint. They don't have radio, they don't have broadcast, they're not even recording it. So you're reading people's speeches, and so the ear is following the eye. So it's a very different kind of environment. But those speeches are great if you can tolerate getting into them. I really like that. 19th, especially stuff on the Missouri question. That's like something I'm really interested in, which is the thing that almost broke the Union apart in the 1850s. So, but anyway, great question. There is a scholar in the field who wanted to do a rhetorical analysis, rhetorical criticism of the Declaration of Independence, and so we have Thomas Jefferson's complete library at the Library of Congress. I don't know if you know that or not. We have almost every book that Jefferson owned in his life is there. They have it all together, and so he went and read them all. And then he felt like he could get into Jefferson's head a little bit better. Isn't that wild? And it's like all this weird stuff. Like Jefferson was a Francophile, right? He had those weird French books that are like, kind of like probably trash. And he was just like, oh, the French, this is real culture. And like Hamilton's like, oh God, spare us, this guy. Like they really didn't like each other. I know everybody knows this now because of the musical. It used to be that people didn't really know how much they hated each other. But they really did. It's, oh my God, this guy, he wears these like ruffled shirts. What is wrong with him?
Let's take one last question in the public setting, and then if anyone's interested, I'm sure Professor Ronald will stick around and do more. But one last question from the audience. Okay, go ahead.
This theory of existential
or the Zelensky's twisted existential speech. Do you think it would only work if there is some sort of tangible crisis going on, like a war, or do you think it could be manufactured? Do you think the same effect could be manufactured using a less tangible crisis?
Sure. I mean, I think the tangibility is an effect of good rhetoric, right? So let's take COVID-19. I think is a good example of this, where they could have really made it very, very scary, but the Trump administration didn't want to do that for whatever reason, so they just downplayed the whole thing. With somebody else in there, it really depends on how would you construct that. Say, we don't know what this could do to you now, to you in the future, to your children. You could really kind of inflate it to a point where people are like, oh my God, what should we do? But what you want is inaction in a pandemic, right? You want people to stay home. So you want that to sound more like that fear would be a powerful thing, but they didn't do that. And it's only going to be in the next couple of years that we're going to get the fear as the more neurological data comes out about what it does to you if you've had it 2 or 3 years down the line. And that's the kind of stuff they should have brought up early. It's like, we do not know what this is. And that might have been a way to do it. A war helps, I think this helps a lot, but it could easily have been, Zelensky, you can do a thought experiment, be like, Zelensky could easily say, this is free Ukraine, a democratic republic against the evil forces of Russia. And that would have fit perfectly in our expectations of what a president of an assaulted country would do. But it really wouldn't get the buy-in needed. He understands what's at stake in a way a lot of heads of state might not understand and say, we're being attacked, come to our aid. Come and help the Democratic Republic of Ukraine. It's like, we are the barrier between you and World War III, which will be thermonuclear war. Okay, that gets your attention. That gets your attention, right? And it's very scary, and it's unsettling. And your position as an American or a European or whatever you are is not enough protection, because those old roles do not offer any kind of narrative to piece it together. It's almost like, if you want to inflate the tangibility of it, it has an ironic relationship with how you can tell a story about it. So the less of a story you can tell, the more panic is instilled in humans. We're narrative creatures. We want to always have a story. We want to always have, you're telling a story about yourself all the time. And the news is like our top story. Wait, I thought you were factual. Why is it your top story? It's because it's such a powerful device for understanding the world. You know, it's like when you're giving a report in class and you're just giving the information, it's kind of boring, right? Or when a professor just gives the information, it's boring. It's much more interesting when the professor says, I have a take on this and here's why. Everybody leans in. So it's like the irony of the confidence with the buy-in is working here too. Which is like, let me tell you what this is. This is an effect of the collapse, even in immunity. The threat Russia's presenting is evidence for the collapse of the entire security apparatus that's held the world together since World War II. Wow, okay. That's a big statement, right? But he's kind of creating that fear. He's like, we don't have, none of the normal levers, or we're pulling the levers and they're not working. It's broken, right? And so that gets the fear going. So I think tangibility is an effect of how you construct it. And I think with COVID in this country, other countries I think did a different kind of job. It would be worth studying the public health messaging there. But here it was just downplayed as like, I think it's a flu, right? I don't know. It was made more familiar. And I think if you wanted to make it to where people have more buy-in, you would make it less familiar. Less familiar is less scary. The less of a story you can tell about it, the more reticent people are to act. Because narratives are empowering. Narratives are the source of politics, I'd say.
Professor Ronald will speak on debate tomorrow at 2:45 p.m. at Washburn Observatory. Let's give him a round of applause.